Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. This webinar is sponsored by the Baker Institute for Public Policy and their Center for the United States and Mexico. We're grateful to you and to our many sponsors, including but not limited to Haynes and Boone, for making this all possible. When at the center, when we planned this webinar about 5 months ago, it seemed pretty clear to us that issues relating to the U.S. China trade war and other pressures toward resourcing of supply chains away from China back to North America, back to the U.S., would continue to be among the most important concerns for the next administration, whether Mr. Trump was reelected or Mr. Biden was reelected. And I think that's been a pretty good bet. As has been widely reported in the press yesterday and today, President Biden is meeting today with a group of business leaders who are going to discuss supply chain resiliency, not all of which is related to China, but they're talking about critical areas: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earths, and large batteries. Government subsidies for the chip industry to help expand its production in the U.S. Were authorized by Congress some months ago, but up to now, they have not appropriated the funds. I think there's some risks to doing this now. The Biden administration has been in office only about 5 weeks. A lot of the trade policy issues have not yet been articulated. We'll probably learn more tomorrow when USTR designate Catherine Tai has her hearing before the Senate. It's already been clear here and there that many of the Trump administration policies are going to be continued in one form or another. Delisting Chinese firms with connections to the military, the Phase 1 trade agreement with its $370 billion worth of penalty tariffs doesn't seem to be going anywhere in the foreseeable future. And I think the bipartisan concerns over human rights, illegal subsidies, intellectual property violations, and threats against Taiwan, among others, haven't gone away either. And as some of you have seen, when Mr. Trump made a decision on the 13th of January to ban cotton imports from the Uyghur areas, and that's being continued as well. So closer to home, I think the Biden administration is going to be seeking strict enforcement of the labor provisions of the USMCA, in part because Catherine Tai was material in negotiating those, with other friction areas being some of the discriminatory rules against foreign investors. Hard to know how any of that's going to work out. I was, among others, I'm sure, pleased to see that in a Zoom meeting yesterday between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden, the tone was markedly different from what it had been a few months ago. I think we'll still have to wait and see whether the substance of the relationships continues. We have a panel of experts from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to discuss these issues today. I'll introduce them briefly in the order in which they're going to speak. Ed Lebow is counsel to the Washington, D.C. office of Haynes and Boone's. He heads the firm's international trade practice. He was assistant general counsel for litigation at the USTC, U.S. International Trade Commission, several years ago, I think. And he's had more than 30 years of private practice representing clients pretty much from all over the world in trade and other types of disputes. He's very active now with the Foreign Investment Review process, CFIUS, sanctions, and other issues of that sort. Lisa Mark, also with Haynes and Boone, began in the Shanghai office. She serves as its chief representative and administrative partner. She's practiced as a U.S. lawyer in the United States and Hong Kong and Shanghai for over 2 decades, and she's also qualified as a lawyer in Hong Kong. She's worked extensively on many cross-border transactions and has a good sense, I think, in dealing with the differences between doing deals in Asia and in the U.S. She also has led a number of multiple associations and organizations that further gender and race-based diversity in business and legal management. Excuse me. Simon Potter has more than 4 decades of legal practice in commercial and institutional litigation, arbitration, mediation, administrative law, trade, and international law, mostly out of Montreal. I think we first worked together on a case maybe 35 years ago or something like that. He's been recognized as a leader in his fields by Chambers Global, Best Lawyers, Lexpert, and a lot of others. He's appeared before as lead counsel before all of the Canadian federal and Quebec courts, and he's many administrative tribunals and boards, and again, represented clients in a broad range of trade issues, trade agreements, investment issues, and also served as a panelist in a number of NAFTA panels. He was president of the Canadian Bar Association in the past. He's a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and a member of the London College of International Arbitration. Ildefonso Guajardo Villarreal is a Mexican economist and politician from the PRI. As most of you know, he was previously the Secretary of the Economy of Mexico during the Peña Nieto regime. And he's also served as a deputy of the legislature in the Mexican Congress representing Nuevo León. He's been in the government for a number of years before going into private consulting, wide range of leading positions, international organizations in the public sector, legislative, executive branches, international trade, trade negotiations, economic competition, industrial policy, all of the issues that we're looking at today. Among the most important, at least from my point of view, is that he was a leader in negotiation in the conclusion by Mexico of the USMCA, the free trade agreement with the European Union, which was recently revised, and the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. What the plan is to ask Ed Levo to speak. He will turn over the virtual microphone to Lisa, and then she to Simon, and finally Simon to Ildefonso. And then we will have time left, I think, quite a bit for questions. If you could, in the audience, if you could provide your questions primarily in the question and answer feature of Zoom, I will try to get to all of them, or at least as many as I can. So Ed, why don't you go forward?
David, profound disappointment. Those two words, I think, summarize the U.S. feeling towards our relation with China, how it's developed the last 15 years. When China acceded to the WTO in December 2001, I think there was a great deal of optimism. We saw reform in China, and we thought that China was going to integrate into the world quasi-market economy system. Since then, we've learned to our chagrin that reform in China means something very different than reform means to us. It means perhaps modernization and strengthening of the party, the Communist Party, rooting out corruption and cementing the power of the party. But it doesn't mean becoming like us. And I think over the past, especially 5 years, a sense of regret and even a feeling of naivete has set in the United States. What we see now is state financing of favorite industries and the enhanced role of state-owned enterprises in China. We see requirements that US companies transfer their technology to joint venture partners to gain access to the Chinese market. We see the Made in China 2025 plan being expanded, and China emphasizing that it wants to be a world leader in advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence and semiconductors. We see China making foreign investments, FDI, in new and emerging technological areas, and perhaps the government quietly targeting some of these investments and targeting some exports. We've had allegations of outright IP theft. And of course, there are the growing Chinese military capabilities, including its activities in the South China Sea and threats against Taiwan. Overall, there's been a recognition of rather authoritarian tendencies on behalf of the Chinese Communist parties. Digital surveillance and facial recognition technology is becoming more widespread in China. Of course, there's the mistreatment of the Uyghurs. There's the application of the national security law to Hong Kong and Hong Kong's loss of its character as a special, more democratic area within China. There have been the taking of 2 Canadian innocent business people as essentially hostages to be held in exchange for Canada's holding Meng Wanzhou of Huawei at the behest of the United States. And I'm sure Simon will be speaking a bit more about the uncomfortable position Canada's been put in by that. There has been a lack of transparency on behalf of the Chinese authorities as to the genesis of the coronavirus. The US has found that it has had to rely much too much on Chinese and other foreign sources, but primarily Chinese, for personal protective equipment, ventilators, and other important pharmaceutical and medical supplies and devices. And of course, there's a consistent trade that we've heard so much about from former President Trump. The result of all this is that there is now bipartisan support in the US Congress and throughout the country for being tough on China. In fact, this is one of the few areas of bipartisan agreement within the United States government and polity. Now, China, for its own part, also has grievances, and not without reason. China has felt that the West, for centuries really, has abused it and taken advantage of it. It resents the resistance to its own economic development and becoming technologically and commercially competitive. In the phone call on February 6th between the chief of the Chinese Foreign Relations Department, Yang Jiechi, and new US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, Yang warned Blinken that he feels the US is wanting to block China's legitimate rise. Overall, China just feels a real disrespect for its system from the United States. It sees geopolitical arrogance on behalf of the Americans. US does in Asia what we'd never allow China to do in the Western Hemisphere. It's the kind of the hypocrisy of the Monroe Doctrine. There is a belief also in China that its system works best in light of Chinese history and the centripetal of falling apart the nature of China for decades. And this party and system has now pulled China together, regained its historical strength, and of course has succeeded like no one else in history in bringing huge numbers of people out of poverty. And finally, China sees what it believes to be corruption in the US system with money buying elections. So there's certainly some negative attitudes towards the United States in China, and the government and the party show no hesitation in using these feelings and nationalism in order to help engender support for the party itself. So what's the US doing about this? I think the most important thing is that we've really tightened up on our controls on foreign investment. As many of you know, the United States for years has had something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, which gave the government authority to review certain controlling investments in high-tech areas of the US economy, areas with real military or security significance. But it was used in a limited fashion, most famously for Arab investments in US ports, or Chinese investments in US petrochemical industries. But what has happened since August of 2018 is the United States has tightened CFIUS rules, and now non-controlling investments in what are called critical technologies, which are basically any technologies which are subject to tight export controls, are subject to CFIUS review, as are investments in areas that could reveal sensitive personal information, such as certain medical kinds of technologies, and in certain real estate. And the result of all this, as Lisa will get into in more detail, has been a real fall off in Chinese FDI into the United States. With respect to Huawei, the controls go both ways. US telecommunications systems are not permitted to purchase Huawei equipment, and exports of US semiconductors and other types of sensitive equipment to Huawei are prohibited, and now we've extended that even to the use in third countries of U.S. semiconductor manufacturing equipment to produce things to go to Huawei. And the whole issue of extraterritoriality of U.S. controls is an area of real sensitivity, both between the United States and China, and to a lesser degree between the United States and these third countries. And again, I think Simon may be touching on that. We've also, in the United States, put controls on purchases of bulk power system equipment from China. We've added many, many more Chinese companies to the category of military end users that can't receive US equipment. We've expanded our do not export list called the entity list to include a number of major Chinese companies, including the China National Offshore Oil Corporation and the big semiconductor manufacturing international corporation. We've actually rescinded a number of export licenses, even securities transactions that might support the Chinese military have been restricted. Most recently, something called the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act was passed, and it's designed to present misleading financial data being used to support US stock exchange listings by Chinese companies. And in fact, there was a movie on Amazon just the past few months called The China Hustle, which expounds upon this problem. So there's also an underlying popular culture supporting some of these restrictions. And of course, as David mentioned, there are trade restraints based on alleged human rights abuses, especially the treatment of the Uyghurs with the cotton purchase restrictions for cotton from Xinjiang province. The US has also revoked Hong Kong's special status. It's now treated just like the rest of China. And last but not least, there are those tariffs, which President Trump put on many months ago now, and they're staying in place, and the Biden administration doesn't show much indication of a willingness or an eagerness to get rid of them. Lisa, why don't you turn now to what the impact of all these actions have been on FDI and on supply chains? You have to unmute.
Sorry. Sure, let me share my screen first. Okay, so the topic of the day is to discuss the relations between US and China and its impact on USMCA. As David and Ed had mentioned in rapid fashion, right? The tension between US and China has significantly ratcheted up in the last 4 years. And it doesn't seem like, even though Biden has only been in office for 5 weeks, it doesn't seem like that the Biden administration is going to seriously chill the heated tension between the two countries. First, there are many reasons for it, but at this point, it doesn't look like the fundamental competition position between the two countries will change. And so we're looking at a shifting situation for both cross-border investments and, more importantly, cross-border supply chain. You add COVID-19 to the mix and things become even more uncertain. So I'll run you through a little bit of statistics, and Simon and Alfonso will probably talk about the implications and effects. But as between US and China, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development recently put out a study where they essentially said, look, China has in 2020 surpassed the US as the largest recipient of FDI. Globally, FDI in 2020 had collapsed by 42%. But China, in fact, grew their GDP by 2.3%, the only large economy that grew it. And so they received investment from foreign direct investments up to 163 billion. And that has surpassed the 134 billion attracted by the US. So that is a striking sort of statistics to note, that money on a global scale seems to be shifting more to China, partly because they recovered from the COVID situation better. As for the supply chain situation, which has the most effect on the USMCA, we're noticing before all of this, even before the Trump administration, that the supply chain is shifting and balkanizing, right? The Trump administration, U.S. China tension, and also the COVID-19 situation merely exacerbates the trend and provides a small shift to it as well. When I say balkanization, what I mean is supply chain seems to be regionalizing, where you're looking at it and thinking, okay, because of the difficulties of creating supply chains all over the world and very extensive long supply chains, and because that the China market with the 1.4 billion people that are consumers is too big to be ignored by international companies, you then might have two separate supply chains or two large regional supply chains where you're keeping supply in China for China and Asia. And you are then looking at potentially moving some of your supply chain for Europe and the Western world into Southeast Asia, or closer to home, where we call it nearshoring, into Mexico or into Canada. As focused on China, what we're seeing is, according to QIMA, a supply chain monitor, requests for inspection and audits by US firm in China slipped a total of 3% in 2020 as compared to a sharp drop in 2019. So the data seems to show that even though supply chain seems to be moving out of China as a trend line all the way up to 2019, that seems to have reversed itself somewhat in 2020, potentially because COVID created a mass demand for certain fundamental materials like PPEs, and China has the most established manufacturing and logistics infrastructure. So when in doubt, when it's very unstable, you go with the known quality and you keep your supply chain where it is for now. I personally think that the supply chain situation is going to continue with its trend line of moving out of China, because there are many factors where the lower quality and cheaper manufacturing no longer makes sense in China anymore. We're seeing that the demand for inspections and audits from US firm increased 19% in Southeast Asia in 2020. So we do see that the major beneficiary of this trend of moving the supply chain out of China is going more towards Southeast Asia, whereas some of the other places like Mexico and Canada has not received as much beneficiary. Again, as I mentioned, this trend is not new. It started basically in 2017 and has been ongoing for a while now. And it's not merely because of the US-China trade tension. There are many different other reasons for encouraging a shift in supply chain. However, we are seeing that a lot of international business are basically saying that nearly 87% of the companies report no plans to shift production out of China. Part of it is because they are anticipating that they need to serve the China market. About 11% out of the U.S. China Business Council report say that they are planning to shift, and potentially Thailand and Mexico are the leading alternative destinations that they're considering. again, essentially, the concept is there's probably going to be balkanization, even with the Biden administration's expectation of trying to bring more supply chains onshore. And essentially, this is an unfortunate consequence where we're seeing that the U.S. does not appear to be winning the trade war, because China, as a manufacturing base, even when the U.S. tries to shift their supply chain, other countries seems to be coming in and taking the manufacturing capabilities out of China. So with that, let me hand it off to Simon to talk about the Canadian aspect to this.
Thank you. Just how interesting all that is as context for us. I think that sets the stage very nicely. So thank you very much. The Canadian perspective on this is naive in some ways. I say that as a good naive Canadian, but it's full of hope and optimism, and maybe a bit too much. And I can see Ildefonso laughing. He's used to the Canadian negotiators seeing the world as a rosy place where everyone can get along. And Canada's still like that, even when it's obvious that it's not going to be the case. So the Pollyanna attitude of Canada is going to continue. However, it's starting to get a touch more realistic, and maybe we can just explore how. First of all, Canada was extraordinarily relieved to get the USMCA, which of course Canada calls the CUSMC, whatever, the new free trade agreement. Relieved because the threat was considered real of losing the North American integrated market under the NAFTA. And the unpredictability of the outcome of those negotiations was a real difficulty in Canada, not just for government, but for all business. So the fact that we've ended up with an agreement, which even though the NAFTA was the worst agreement the trade world had ever seen, and the USMCA is the best one the world has ever seen, the fact is they're very similar. And Canada is very relieved to have that. Canada always saw that integrated North American market as part of a three-legged stool, eventually a multi-legged stool. Canada is in the TPP, has a free trade agreement to the west. Canada is in the North American free trade region, has a free trade agreement to the south. Canada has a free trade agreement already negotiated with Europe, the CETA, so it has a free trade agreement to the east. Canada is also very actively involved in Mercosur, in developments there and negotiations. Canada already has an interim agreement in place with the United Kingdom and will have a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom if the United Kingdom does not decide to come into the TPP. So Canada's three-legged stool is working itself out very well. And I know that Ildefonso has seen things quite similarly from the Mexican perspective, wanting to make sure that Mexico is not standing on one leg in all of this. For Canada, that three-legged stool has always been a matter of preparation for dealing with a world in which it is an eventual likelihood that China will be commercially dominant. So the fact of the USMCA from the Canadian perspective should be seen as part of an overall view of the world where Canada wants to maintain flexibility, wants to maintain a measure of influence here and there, but in a world in which China is becoming more and more important, and there's nothing that can be done to stop that. That said, even though that is forward-looking, China has already in the past played a very large role in Canada's perspective on the USMCA. First of all, in the negotiation of the USMCA, or at least coincidental with it, simultaneous with that negotiation, while we were trying to save the world was being destroyed at the same time. The Trump war, the trade war of various tariffs, reorganized trade routes for many different materials, materials which were important to Canada. And sometimes the reorganization was back one way and back and forth the other way. For example, in agriculture, America shot itself in the foot by depriving its farmers of the ability to sell various products in China. Naturally, the Chinese turned to Canada to get its pigs. What happened? Well, the way to solve that, according to the Trump administration, was to negotiate what it called a trade agreement with China, which wasn't anything of the sort. It was a trade agreement, an agreement which required China to buy products from the United States, actually set targets for it. So the poor Canadian pigs were suddenly left without a market. And it wasn't just the pigs. So Canada has lived an unpredictability, a back and forth here with China because of the MCA. We've had China-directed tariffs. We've had tariffs imposed by the United States, which were meant to discipline China, but really only sideswiped Canada in aluminum and steel. They were imposed on the basis of an American declaration that they were needed to protect the US national interest from Canada. Well, that was a tough one for Canada to swallow, and that will have left a mark in how Canada sees its export markets in the future. And you can bet that there are a lot of people in Canada who see the Chinese market as maybe more promising over the long term than the American market. We had the problem that Ed mentioned of Ms. Meng Wanzhou, whom Canadian authorities arrested at the request of Washington, only to find 2 Canadians snatched off the street in Beijing and imprisoned, and they're still in prison. And then we watched President Trump not once but twice make Meng Wanzhou a pawn of negotiation, to say that, you know, we could be perhaps reasonable in the Meng Wanzhou case if only China would be reasonable on trade. We had Canada leaping into the TPP in part to create the North American bulwark in the Pacific against China, and then the USA abandoned it. So we have had China playing a role in the Canadian view of what its relationship is with the United States for some years already. And it has not just been China which has been more difficult than we all hoped it would be. As Ed so rightly said, we had such high hopes, didn't we, for China to come and play the rules-based game. And then suddenly China wasn't going to be like us. Well, it's true. China has proven that it's less easy to deal with than we had all hoped it might be. But so has the United States. The United States has been much more difficult to deal with than we all hoped the United States would be. And I think that's worth saying. But here we are. We've got a new administration. We have the USMCA. Where are we? A few challenges from the Canadian perspective. Buy America. President Biden went through his primary campaigns and the presidential campaign and his time since he's been in office talking about Buy America. Buy America is going to be a real thorn. And Canada will be trying very hard to make sure that it is treated as American for various procurement projects under the Buy America provisions. That's going to be a difficulty in Washington. Canada knows it. But we have this supply chain executive order of just this morning in which the administration makes a new and a very pointed reference to the need to ensure supply chains, not just for America, but for America and its allies and friendly nations. It's not just America first, last, and always anymore. And so the challenge is there, but it is perhaps a bit easier to deal with now. We have challenges about strategic metals, the rare earths and the strategic metals. And there again, we also have statements coming out of the American administration paving the way perhaps to a view that a mine developing niobium, let's say, in Northern Ontario is just as strategic to the United States as one which might exist in the United States, and more strategic than one which exists in Brazil, or more strategic certainly than one which exists in China. Canada, naive as always, still has the Pollyannish expectations about China, which it now hopes, with Biden reviving the WTO, with things becoming more calm, that perhaps we can think again of working with China within the WTO, bringing all countries, including the United States and China, to a more rules-based view of the world. This is essential for Canada. Canada is a tiny country, 1/10 the population of the United States, but it is a trading economy. 50 cents of its dollar is exports, and 75% of that 50 is exports to the United States. So the United States must, in Canada's view, assist Canada in bringing the world to a rules-based, or back to a rules-based view of international trade. I want to say something about national interest. The USA sees national interest just about everywhere from the Canadian point of view, even seeing Canadian exports of aluminum and steel as being difficult for it on a national interest basis. One of the practical difficulties for Canada is going to be that the USA sees national interest in terms which are very much more naturally America-centric than Canada views it. Canada views those interests much more on a global level, that is to say, Europe, Canada. And that leads me to my final point. The Canadian view of things, Pollyannish, naive, rules-based, disciplines-based, there's some emotion involved in there too. And Canada has these emotional ties to Europe. An enormous proportion of Vancouver has family ties in Hong Kong, direct family ties in Hong Kong. Canada has an emotional leaning more and more and more to Africa these days. Canada has a long-standing emotional drive not to want to be too much the mouse to the American elephant. Those emotional drives are big in Canada too. So all that to say, we have in Canada Pollyanna, who is slowly waking up and going to try and play a constructive role, all the while preserving its own flexibility. It means playing a double-sided game, a double-faced game in some ways, being nice to the United States, but trying to be nice to China too, all the while trying to bring people into the family. So that is the Canadian perspective. You're on mute, David.
Ildefonso, your turn.
Thank you, David. Well, basically, I think that we have a very good base on all the information that has been shared. And I thank Ed, Lisa, and definitely my Canadian colleague for his contribution to this discussion. First of all, let me make a point about negotiating USMCA. We call it TEMEC in Mexico. You have to understand that when we started this process, the Canadian and the Mexican approach to the challenge was not the same. I think at some point, my friend Chrystia Freeland had this impression that we had just to weather the nightmare until Mr. Trump was going to be impeached, and then the nightmare was going to disappear. The Mexican perspective to that was that we will be facing a long-term challenge, although we have to make time our ally and do not bend to Washington interest immediately. But we knew that the nightmare was not going to be over. And even today, with Mr. Trump out of office, the nightmare is not over. because the way the new agreement has been built imposes a lot of requests and requirements from NAFTA partners that are not imposed on South Asia countries. And with the MFN system that we have today, the MFN rate in the US on average is below 3.5%. So if you are a supplier from Vietnam to the US, when the US is not part of TPP, it's easier to export manufacturing from Vietnam to the US than what is going to happen in North America, because you are going to be, you have to comply with the labor standards and the labor requirements. Therefore, the burden on Canada and Mexico in the new scenario is going to be definitely very, 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 very important. And therefore, the way in which USMCA was constructed is that the long-term perspective of the Trump administration was to play it very hard with other countries in terms to get benefits from the North American market. So we have to, in order to answer the main question of this dialogue, what is the impact of the U.S.-China trade war on the future of USMCA, we have to understand how the architecture of the new agreement has been set forward. Now, in this discussion, it is a fact that China, for the last 2 decades, has been the silent partner of the former NAFTA. I mean, it was just by fact, the 4th member of NAFTA. If you look at the share of imports from Canada, the United States and Mexico coming from China, they are very impressive. In the US is 18%, in Mexico is 19%, and in Canada is 14%. One of the elements that was there always behind our discussions is that the Trump administration was highly irritated by the influence of China in the North American market. As a matter of fact, one of the stories that I can share with you, it was the first week in January of 2018, and I hold a meeting with Robert Lighthizer in his office for 4 hours, trying to get our hands on the tougher issues of the negotiation. And he was really upset. He was upset because in 2017, at the end, the Prime Minister of Canada went to China to see Xi Jinping to offer a free trade agreement between Canada and China. He went there, and it was part of the news, and the Americans were very, very angry about those news. Now, what happened after that meeting in China, it was predictable. I was smiling about Simon's comment because it was predictable. Mr. Trudeau arrived in the meeting with Xi and told him we want a trade agreement with Canada and China in the middle of USMCA negotiations. And the Chinese leader said, yes, let's do it. And Mr. Trudeau went on to say, yes, but our agreements have to contain labor rights, environmental rights, gender equality. And then Mr. Xi said, well, come back in 100 years. We may comply with those things. So they came back empty-handed, but they left the Americans very angry. In that meeting, in the first week of January 2018, Mr. Lighthizer asked me, and basically didn't ask, just said, if we are going to do this agreement, we have to have a paragraph that none of the USMCA members can do a trade agreement with China. He wanted a paragraph just like that. And I told Bob Lighthizer, I said, well, Bob, if that is your request, I just have to give up on the agreement, because my senators, my Congress will never allow me to sign a paper that will restrict the freedom of Mexico to do a trade agreement with whoever we want to make an agreement. So I cannot sign a paper saying Mexico commits that Mexico will not do a trade agreement with China. We started there with that paragraph, and we ended up in the paragraph that you can read now in the agreement, the 32.10 paragraph, that says none of the USMCA members can make a trade agreement with a non-market economy. Well, it doesn't say that you cannot do a trade agreement. It says the USMCA members, if they are going to do a trade agreement with a non-market economy, they have to give notice to the USMCA members and provide the agreement before signing it. So the members of USMCA keep the right to leave USMCA if they want. Well, that paragraph does not take away any sovereign rights of your country, because we already had in the agreement in NAFTA and now in USMCA that any of the countries can leave the agreement with 6 months notice. So the paragraph is meaningless at the end of the day. So it was the story of what happened, and you could sense that behind this policy aim of the US was to restrict China's influence in North American trade. That was a fact. Now, what is the reality today? China is a main player in the sourcing of North American production. Is the NAFTA, is the China-US trade war going to benefit North American integration? It has the potential to do so, and we can take advantage of that. But it's not going to be automatic. We have to do a lot of work to make that happen. And I agree with Lisa that the evidence today is that most of the outsourcing is going to go to South Asia countries rather than coming back to North America. There was a paper done by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that shows how costly it is to decouple the U.S. economy with China. If we are going to attempt to do that, we have to have a lot of homework done in North America, specifically in Mexico. If we are going to attract investment resourcing from China into North America and Mexico, we have to compete with infrastructure, connectivity, productivity. We have to really make up for the efficiency that is going to be lost in the supply chain process. Therefore, the responsibility that we have in the North American countries, particularly in Mexico, is that we have to have an agenda to improve competitiveness, to improve productivity, and to really take advantage of these moves. I'm a witness that in northern Mexico, we are already having announcements about investments, mostly in the auto industry, because of the new rules of origin that are expressed in the USMCA agreement. Things that were not done in Mexico before, like aluminum casting, like new and advanced plastics for the auto industry. So there are new investors coming into Mexico looking for opportunities to supply the North American market. But the challenge is we have to have the Mexican government and the private sector align in a strategy to really attract effectively these investments, looking for relocation in North America. Now, on the Mexican challenge about the public sector, there has been a lot of actions that are not strengthening trust for investors. Most of these actions had to do with energy, had to do with policy actions that are related to government concessions. So there are going to be conflicts in USMCA coming from investors that have trusted the energy sector. There are going to be some elements that will basically arise with some investment done in areas that are related to transportation. But it is very important that we keep the framework in the manufacturing sector not affected by these new policy elements that are coming out of the Mexican administration. So, as I say to the firms and my clients in my consulting firm, if you are going to invest in Mexico in manufacturing for the export sector, the risk is much lower, is very low compared if you are thinking about investments in the energy, oil, electricity, in solar, wind electricity. But therefore, even that will have an impact in the medium and long term in the cost of operations in Mexican territory. They will not have an impact in the short term, but it will affect the matrix for competitiveness of the manufacturing sector in the long term. So in order to come to a conclusion in this first comment, I will say that definitely there is an opportunity to capitalize in North America these new opportunities. But at the same time, and let me make a reference to something very interesting that David had mentioned. In order for this to work, we have to take the multilateral approach in order to bring China into compliance with the multilateral trading system. If we don't take the multilateral approach, and if we lose in North America the efficiency of the value chain coming from China, the advantage will be taken by other regions in the world. The North American industry will lose competitiveness, and if we are just alone an individual aim to confront China, those advantages can be taken by other regions, like Lisa was suggesting, like Asia has an integral unit, or Europe, if they don't follow the same approach than North America. Therefore, it is obviously something extremely relevant that the Biden administration takes on again the responsibility of the US to lead the efforts in WTO to bring back China to the table. Because if we don't do it multilaterally, then we are going to distort the advantages between trading regions in the world. And we may be the losers at the end of the day. So I will leave my comments here, and I will be very interested to engage in a discussion.
Thank you very much to all of you. Let me start with one of the audience questions for Ildefonso. The correspondent says, are you saying that the rules of the trade agreements between the US and North America and between the US and South Asia, like Thailand, Vietnam, and such, are different in such a way that it will benefit South America?
No, it will benefit South Asia. What I'm saying is,
yes.
Yeah, South Asia. What I'm saying is, let's review something very, very concrete. Today, U.S. unions are looking very much into how labor rights are enforced in the manufacture of auto parts in Mexico. So there are new rules in Mexico that after we change our labor laws that imply a lot of requirements in terms of labor rights, transparency, voting for unions, labor contracts. And firms in Mexico are very responsible organizing to meet those requirements. But those are, at the same time, as you may know, incentives to use as an excuse these new commitments for protectionism. They may abuse in bringing cases not founded, but just to make pressures to protect some industries. Now, if you are exporting auto parts from Vietnam into the US and you have to pay a 2% MFN rate, what will be cheaper for you, to pay the 2% MFN rate or to comply with very strict labor standards? So then if you do not confront this as one challenge vis-a-vis the world, then you are going to open the door for other regions to take advantage. Not China, because now you are increasing rates to China above MFN rates. But then you will open the door for other economies that will not comply with high labor standards and will take advantage of the North American supply chain.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the other three of you to comment on that, but starting with Ed, but if you could add to your comments a point that I think you made in discussion with me a while before, is a solution, a partial solution to the problem that our correspondent and Ildefonso have been discussing, U.S. rejoining the TPP.
You know, I think that the U.S. government would like to rejoin the TPP. I think, as Ildefonso and Simon were saying, for the United States to succeed in setting a rules-based standards for international trade, we need to do it on a multilateral basis of the free market economies. The problem the Biden administration has is that it really needs to hold the votes of working Americans. And it needs to win more solidly the northern Rust Belt states, the blue wall of Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And in order to do that, it's got to be very careful about engaging in anything which is seen to be exposing those workers to more foreign competition and low prices. So it seems to me right now what we have is a question of timing. The US wants to get back into the TPP. It wants to be multilateral, but politically, the administration knows that it can't move too quickly. So if its COVID response package and its other steps to stimulate the economy and its infrastructure development plan get going in the next year, 18 months, and really strengthen the economy and the confidence of the administration, then I think a year or two down the road, we'll see it more likely to join into the TPP. And for those of us who want to see the United States be more multilateral in its international operations, we also think that the Biden administration has to remain in power and not be replaced by Trump or Trump light. So we have to perhaps forgive their pacing here in order to reach the long-term goal.
Thank you. Lisa, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I'm struck both in the data and also in this conversation as to how complex the supply chain and the world trade system has gotten over the course of the last 20 years. So I think any regulator, any decision maker should be very careful of unintended consequences, particularly unintended consequences to, for example, the allies or the other countries that are not US and China. So when I say unintended consequences, let me give you an example. Recently, there was news coming out saying that over 1,500 employees in the GM plant in Kansas City was permanently laid off because of a shortage of chip, lower end chip, not very high end chip, but chips for manufacturing of cars. And the reason why there is a global shortage of these types of chips is partly because of supply chain issues related to COVID, but also partly because of export controls for kind of SMIC, and also because there's a semiconductor war, so to speak, between US and China. So all the chip manufacturers or anyone that requires chips are stockpiling them. So I think for a lot of these trade policies, it's very easy to kind of have the, okay, China's bad actor and therefore we want to kind of punish them. But if you really look at this from the business world's point of view, you realize that China's too big of a market to completely ignore. And any policy that is simple will probably not work because, as Alfonso says, if you only limit a region and apply different rules, then you're going to allow other regions to take advantage. And ultimately, you might be the loser. So I think I certainly support the let's take some time, let's take a very holistic global view approach and try to work out a system that works and minimizes as much unintended consequences as possible.
Thank you. Simon?
Yes, I think the short answer to your question, David, would the TPP be a good avenue for the United States to achieve the kind of multilateral approach which Ildefonso recommends? And the answer to that is yes. I'm tempted to go further than yes and say that it is essential and insufficient. It's essential because there's no real prospect of negotiating something else, some parallel institution to the TPP. But some institution is needed on a Pacific basis, and probably even more than Pacific. As I said before, the UK is wondering whether it should just join that agreement. It is a modern trade agreement. It does provide for many of the things that we need in trade agreements, and it does provide for the protections against unilateralism, which Ildefonso so correctly wants. I will say about the unilateral approach, quite agree with Ed that we have to be patient while America works through its political obstacle course to get to the right place. But in the meantime, America, the population of America, has to learn that the unilateralism not only will fail in the end for the reasons that Ildefonso has given, but that it has already proven to fail. The unilateral just protect America first, last, and always has failed. It produced huge problems in the United States. And the only prospect of helping the United States over the next 50 years is for America to re-become the leader of a rules-based trading world. So I say TPP, yes, essential, needed, has to be done, but it's not enough. America has to get in, become active, and reassume the kind of leadership which it once had, which was the first words pretty well out of the lips of our prime minister on the phone call or the Zoom call, which they had, that America has been absent too long from the leader's chair. And we're so glad it's back. It just now has to play the role.
Thank you. Some really good questions from the audience. Let me paraphrase one. I think it has to do mostly with the issue of whether the U.S. is really prepared to see the global supply chain develop in countries such as China, but certainly not limited to China. You could add Vietnam as well. Do you think this is going to be an area of struggle? I mean, if you look at the U.S.-China relationship, there are many observers who say, well, the U.S. just doesn't want China to become a developing country. How is this kind of feeling? And I would start with Lisa, because I think she's in a better position perhaps than the rest of us to talk about perceptions, particularly in China and South Asia, as to whether there's a U.S. policy issue here that is going to cause us a lot of problems in the future. The U.S. essentially seen as trying to hold down some developing countries. I hope I've done a decent job of paraphrasing. Lisa?
I believe certainly in China and in the rest of Asia, there is a great deal of, shall we say, disquiet as to the US's approach for the last 4 years during the Trump administration. I think, quite frankly, the America First only and always does not sell well, not only in China, but also in all the allied countries, even the Japan, Korea, and Canada, Mexico. And I think any country that decides to throw its weight around, like the US, should expect some blowback. Now, one of the data points that we do look at would be perception of the US as a country and perception of the future development of that country, and whether folks are sending their children to school in the US. Before the Trump administration, before this US-China trade war, you see massive amounts of Chinese parents basically saying, we want to send our kids over to the US for tertiary education or even high school education. And that has led a massive amount of foreign exchange into the US. The tertiary education industry is a very large industry in the US. After the Trump administration's various moves, you are now seeing Chinese parents much more inclined to send their children to Europe, Australia, or Canada. US, because of visa restrictions, because of perception-wise, is no longer the first country of choice. And that's probably a good indicator of the perception of how the US has fared.
Thank you. Now I want to combine a couple of questions, I think for Ed. The first aspect of it is we've seen so far that the U.S. has supported in the WTO the Nigerian candidate for Director General. We also saw a day or two ago that there seems to be no inclination to go forward with appointment or reappointment of appellate body members. How does that affect, how is that likely to develop over the next couple of years of the Biden administration? And to what extent is it going to increase or decrease the likelihood that China will be open to participating in the WTO's rules-based system, let's say in the next decade?
Well, all I can say is I hope it is the right step, and I hope it will be seen by China as a small step forward on the part of the United States, and a step which the United States administration can take politically. Steps within the WTO do not get the kind of news play, or nor are they as widely understood as U.S. enters into massive trade agreement with 10 other countries on the Pacific. So I think that it shows where the heart is, and when you have a chasm, or when you have a long journey in front of you, as Chairman Mao said, it begins with a single step.
Thank you. Let me ask, again, combine a couple of questions for Ildefonso. And the questions both have to deal with the extent to which Mexican labor costs, energy costs, and costs for such thing as aluminum for the die casting industry are such that it can be competitive to the extent that the decoupling of the U.S. with China benefits particularly Mexico, but also Canada as well as the U.S. Since the U.S. is obviously going to subsidize certain industries like semiconductors, Mexico probably doesn't have the capacity to do that. So how does Mexico, beyond what you've already said, and you did address this to some extent, how does Mexico move relatively promptly to deal with some of these issues?
Basically, I believe that the industry is aligning their efforts to take advantage of the new rules of origin in the new agreement in USMCA, and I do believe that we will keep our advantage, our competitive advantage in some of the key inputs, and definitely things are happening in that direction. Now, we have to monitor very closely the future in the short time and medium term about the electricity sector. As you know, electricity and gas is a very relevant input in many industries. In the case of steel, aluminum, and some of those industries, the cost of energy is a big part in the equation. So I do believe that the private sector is well aware. Efforts are aligned in terms to prepare and organize to take advantage of this reshoring of investment and new opportunities of supply. Although nothing should be taken for granted, and we should monitor and follow very closely developments in many of these different areas. We have to be competitive in energy in order to take advantage of this. We have to align our labor forces and do not allow that some of these disputes can be pushed by interests that are more protectionist than real concern for labor rights. So I do believe that Mexico is positioned to take advantage of this, but we have to be working very, very closely with the government in order to make sure that these opportunities become reality. Now, making a comment on TPP that had been discussed by my colleagues, I agree that it was a political item that was obviously discarded at the beginning of the Trump administration. But the reality is that the labor movement in the US saw the advantage to work with Democrats. And really, they got in USMCA one of the best deals they ever got in the last 25 years in US history of trade agreements. If the labor movement in the US looks into the opportunity to bring those disciplines into TPP, I think the chances of that to move forward in the political scenario are much better, because labor knows that just by opening up the economy like it is today with very low MFN rates to bring in inputs from Asia, they are going to lose the battle. The only way to grasp their influence in the battle is to trade agreements. So there are ways in which the political system can really induce this possibility. And again, another comment of your question about WTO. It is definitely a good signal that the Biden administration is going back to the table. But unfortunately, WTO is still very, very much stuck with the Doha round agreements. And if we don't work with the big players to get this thing moving forward, we are going to spend the next decade going around the same issues that we spent the last 10 years. So it requires the political commitments of nations like India, China, the US, and the European Union. If those four, they don't get an agreement to push forward, things are going to go like a dog chasing its tail, back round and around without no future.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we have time for maybe one more question that I'm going to ask to everyone to comment on. There have been a number of comments involving, trade and trade agreements between North America and China and South Asia. I wondered if any of you would like to address a little bit further the trade agreements that both Canada and Mexico have with Europe. The CETA that was negotiated a few years ago between Canada and the EU, and the revision of the Mexico EU free trade agreement, which I believe Ildefonso negotiated. As we all know, the transatlantic trade and investment partnership negotiations under Obama pretty much failed. They're not going to be reignited in any reasonable period of time. But the high on the Obama administration's priorities list, I think, is trying to improve trade relationships with the EU, even though they aren't going to result in a trade agreement. So maybe Ed, Lisa, Simon, and Ildefonso in that order, fairly briefly, please.
One point you didn't mention, David, and I'm just going to throw out as my brief comment here, is that there could be a real incentive to move forward with the United Kingdom for a trade agreement with the United States, because it seems a little bit more manageable, and there might be a more willing interlocutor, much less complex than dealing with the EU. That's just one point. The second, and it may be politically, again, a little bit easier sell in the United States. In terms of other trade agreements, you haven't mentioned Latin America at all. We have nothing with Mercosur. The US recently entered into a protocol with Ecuador, very, very simple kind of first steps. And perhaps even if nothing progresses further with Ecuador after the April elections, which is likely to see a socialist candidate winning, perhaps that protocol might serve as a bit of a model for some initial baby steps with Mercosur and other parts of Latin America.
Thank you. Lisa, do you want to add anything?
I have little insight on trade kind of regulation between US and Europe, but I will note that China recently entered into 2 large trade agreements And the first is RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership between 15 Asian Pacific nations, including Australia and New Zealand. And in January of 2021, in fact, China and EU reached the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on investments. So as we've discussed, because of the bilateral nature of the kind of last 4 years of US trade relations, we're now having overlapping and very bilateral kind of trade agreements all over the place. And that is going to cause significant concern for multinationals that are trying to navigate through all of this. And the unintended consequences that I had mentioned, which then causes everybody heartache. Simon?
Yes, thank you. Those are interesting points. Canada, one of the reasons that Canada wanted its agreement with Europe was to make sure that Canada got in there before the United States started negotiating with Europe. Canada was convinced it could get a better deal out of Europe by allowing Europe to set the stage for its eventual negotiations with Washington. And I think that is proving correct. It's proving correct among other ways, along the lines that Lisa has just mentioned. The CETA has an investment protection mechanism with an investor states arbitration or recourse, whereas the USMCA has a watered down investor state protection mechanism, which Canada preferred to walk away from in the USMCA and leave it there only for the United States and Mexico. It was watered down, not by Mexico, as I understand, but by Washington, which saw problems of sovereignty and foreign judges telling America what to do. But now America is going to have to go in and negotiate something with Europe. It's certain. Both Mexico and Canada have a very advantageous access to the European market, which American exporters do not have. And America is going to have to face investment protection discussion with Europe. So anyway, the answer to your question is yes, the CETA is interesting in this discussion. And it's interesting as far as China is concerned, the topic of our conference, because it is the kind of bulwark or example to erect against the Chinese agreement, which Lisa has just mentioned.
Thank you very much. Ildefonso, you get the last word.
Thank you. Well, definitely the first country in the Americas that make a deal with Europe was Mexico in year 2000. Although the deal was not as wide and deep as one's wish, but it was my turn to renegotiate that agreement, and we really went deeper and wider in terms of the scope and the sectors included. And let me make a point here. Negotiating with Europe was definitely the most challenging thing, the biggest challenge was the reactions in Washington. I was in the middle of the USMCA negotiations, and I had to flew down to Hanover for an industrial fair of Hanover. And I took a little stop in Belgium, in Brussels, and all surprise, I close up with Europe. And I have to call Bob Lighthizer telling him, guess what? In my way to Hanover, I have to stop in Brussels, and I just spent 6 hours closing up my agreement with Europe. And Bob, the only thing that Bob told me was, I hope you did not give up my milk rights, my dairy rights, and you didn't give up my system protecting not origin, how you call it in Mexico, denominaciones de origen is a geographical indication, IGs, and I say, well, we did our best, but we also have to protect tequila and mezcal. and I laughed because Bob said, well, be ready because I'm going to be producing tequila in Arizona if you did that. So it was not very very pleasant.
Yeah.
But we did close with Europe. Now, from here to the future, what is my best advice? If Canada has an agreement with Europe, Mexico has an agreement with Europe, and the US may look into the possibilities of having an agreement with Europe, we have to round up our sourcing, our rules of origin, to make it feasible that in our exports to Europe, we can include American inputs, Canadian inputs, and the US can include inputs of the region, has complying with just one requirement, getting into European market. It will be into our advantage. If Europe is a conglomerate of more than 20 countries, we can be a conglomerate of 3 countries dealing with Europe. So I think makes a lot of sense to round up our understandings with Europe as one region.
David, can I just add something? I think that point is so important, because if we do not do that, the fact of having 3 free trade agreements rather than 1 with rules of origin which apply everywhere forces people in the end to only domestic sourcing, because they will meet rules of origin under this treaty and that treaty and this treaty only if they're wholly domestic. So we have to make it so that sources from all 3 sources comply.
Thank you, Simon. We're out of time, so we can't go much longer. I really appreciate the thoughtful and perceptive comments of all 4 of you. I think if anything else, certainly it emphasizes the fact that regardless of the changes that may be taking place, the concept of regional and global supply chains is not going anywhere. And I think for the benefit not only of North America, but for Asia and Europe, changes have to be managed, or hopefully will be managed in a very thoughtful manner. This is a discussion which obviously is going to continue. And again, I'm very grateful to the 4 of you and to the Baker Institute, the Center, and our sponsors for making this all possible. I hope you all have an excellent rest of the day.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.